I think one of the things that people muddle up is guilt and shame. So guilt is I've done something wrong. I feel bad about something I've done, but I can do something about that. I can apologize, not do it again. I can restore in a way. Shame runs a lot deeper, which is I am wrong. There's something faulty about me.
Today is a treat for me because I get to hear more about my guest on a personal level, having known him for 3 years as my counselling tutor. We're going to talk about what it's like growing up with a sibling with a learning disability. Jon Wilson Cooper is a qualified psychotherapist, a trainer, and an organisational consultant with over 38 years' experience of working closely with humans and their emotions. He's the founder and director of the Albany Centre in St Albans, which is a counselling training institute and therapy centre, as well as Mosaic Counselling Services, which is a low-cost counselling service also in St Albans. He's also a TEDx speaker whose talk this year has had 28,500 views in the first 3 days of going live on the TEDx website. He talks about why people hate and how we all do it. Jon has worked all over the world with a wide range of clients, including those with addiction issues, mental health problems, and histories of personal trauma. He has a special interest in helping individuals raise awareness of their blocks to emotional well-being and making positive life choices. Jon, welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh, no, it's so nice for me. I'm so excited because it's so nice for me to talk to you on a more personal level in my space, because normally I'm sitting in a room which is entirely created by you, although I think you're probably going to tell me it's co-created by everybody in the room. Um, and now I'm kind of I've grown up a lot in the last 3 years, but I've always been in the space of, oh, this is the guy in charge and I need to behave myself. Whereas here, I'm in charge.
Revenge. Put me on the spot. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's lovely to be here. And yeah, I mean, I'm really up for the conversation. Yeah.
Fantastic, because actually, before we really dig into it, one of the things that I was nervous about talking to you on here is that this is a very personal podcast, and I
Hmm.
do ask my guests to go deep and talk about really tough things. And
Hmm.
you have always, to me, been someone who's been incredibly private. And that's something that I know is born, well, it's born out of lots of things, and you can tell us about it. But I know one of those things is that as a counsellor, it's about the client, it's not about
Hmm.
you.
Yes.
So what's it like to have to come here and talk about your own personal stuff and put it out in the world?
Well, in some ways, the same principle applies. I mean, as a trainer and as a therapist, I do occasionally share personal stuff, but it's with a lot of consideration about whether or not it's useful to the other person. So I sometimes do disclose as a trainer, but I do think long and hard about the impact of that on people, whether it's going to maybe disable them or whether it facilitates a conversation. Um, so I do think personal experience, mine and students' personal experience, is the richest learning there is. So I'm certainly up for sharing. I think the podcast is the same. I think if my experience is actually useful to people, if it's useful to parents and maybe teenagers that are going through similar experiences that I had as a child, um, that's a good thing. And you know, I've moved beyond feeling any kind of shame about my experience. I think shame was a big part of my teenage years, but I've done sufficient work, I think, on myself to not carry that shame anymore about my experience. So I'm up for answering questions about what happened for me. Mm.
Awesome. We will talk about shame because I think that's something that, I mean, mostly this is parents who are listening to this podcast, but sometimes we do have young people. And I'm not sure that most people know that what they're experiencing is shame in these situations. So it might be quite illuminating. Jon, Just to get us started, tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in your house, and particularly as you came into those adolescent years.
Mm. Well, to give it some context, my brother was born 6 years before me, and he was strangled by the umbilical cord as he was being born, which cut off the oxygen supply to his brain, obviously. Um, my parents were told he probably wouldn't survive the night. Um, and then the doctors said, if he does, he'll be fine, but it's unlikely he's going to survive the night. So my parents, they got him baptized. They were Christian at the time. And they just kind of braced themselves, I think, for him to die. The doctors didn't put him into an incubator. So, I mean, there was a lot of negligence involved around his birth. Apparently, it's fairly common to be born with the umbilical cord around your neck, and it just needs to be dealt with rapidly. And the child needs to go into an incubator. Those things didn't happen. So the result of that was, I think, a very large part of his brain was killed off, a very large part. Um, and he did survive. My parents were very slow to recognize that he wasn't hitting developmental milestones. I think in that era, the babies weren't being checked on to the same extent. Nowadays, you see a medical practitioner fairly frequently when you've got a baby. So my brother wasn't properly diagnosed for a while. Um, so yes, he had a severe learning disability. I would say probably the mental age of a 2-year-old, and real limited ability to communicate even. So that was what I was born into, this brother that was 6 years older, but I probably overtook him when I was about 2 in terms of capability. Um, and it restricts everything. There's this concept that when you have a disability in the family's disabled. Um, and so that was very much kind of my experience, that we were different to other families, and we were restricted. So the things that other families would take for granted, we wouldn't do. So we didn't go out to events. We didn't do very much. My family were quite unsocial. Um, and where shame comes into that is being very, very aware of that difference. And thinking, I think as a child, that it reflected on me, that I was somehow different to anybody else. And kind of wanting to hide. And probably the most difficult experience as a child was being dragged around the shops on a Saturday as a family. My parents were very keen that we should all go shopping into the centre of town every Saturday. And I think it was just, that was what we did. So that was probably the only thing we did as a family where we went out into the world. And that was so embarrassing because my brother would have tantrums. So it was a big fight to even leave the house. And then he would just walk up the street, talking to himself, sometimes shouting to himself, waving his arms, directing traffic, all sorts of stuff, which you can imagine is absolutely mortifying when you're 13 and you're trying to be cool. You know, it's like, oh, I really hope I don't bump into anybody from school.
Did that ever happen?
um, When I was very young, yes. When I was in primary school, I remember another kid saying to me, "Oh, your brother's a bit odd. And why is he wearing a radio? Because he had a hearing aid, and one of the really old-fashioned ones with leads and everything."
Oh, poor
Um,
kid.
and it was an odd experience because I was absolutely mortified by the question. And actually, looking back on it, I think it was perfectly innocent.
Yes.
You know, he wasn't making fun of me or of my brother. Actually, he was just asking a question. But I think I had a heightened sense of being judged. Um, and I think that really stuck in my mind. And it's like, I really don't want anyone to see my brother or, yeah, to see me with him.
Right.
Um,
Well, that's the sense I was getting, that yes, it's embarrassing, it's awkward, it's difficult, and it's about your brother, but I had a kind of image in my head of you hiding behind him as you were out there in the center of town.
I think I probably would have hid altogether, not behind him.
Yeah, yeah.
I think if I could have darted down an alley and not been seen at all, that would have been my preference. Um, the difficulty was, I think my parents were so stressed by the whole thing that they had no patience for me at all. So me protesting or wanting to not go with them into
Mhm.
town, I think would have been quite dangerous. They were at the end of their tether, quite often. And that really is the feeling of my childhood. They had, no spare capacity. Um,
Yeah.
and their attitude towards me was, "Well, you're fine, you know,
Right.
we've gotta look after him, you're fine." And that's really stayed with me all my life is like, "Well, you're okay. You don't need anything. You're fine." And that's something I've carried really.
Yeah, what did you do with those feelings if you couldn't voice them to your parents? You knew you weren't going to get the response that you were looking for.
I think I just kind of buried them. I think I really took on their attitudes, which is, "You're making a fuss about nothing."
Right.
Um, I remember my mum saying that a lot. "Oh, you're making a fuss about nothing. Um, stop moaning. You know, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about."
Oh,
There's
yeah,
a
that
real
one.
kind of yes, there's a real intolerance, and I think, I really kind of adapted to that and just shut down and switched off and just had very low expectations of anybody really caring about me, and just kind of getting on with it, um,
Yeah.
to quite extreme extents, actually. There's a few incidents in my childhood where that were quite extreme that I realized I still wasn't going to get what I needed. My first one was when I was 6. A kid in class gave me a piggyback, and I fell over the top and hit the top of my head on solid ground, which split my head, and there's blood everywhere. And what happened is we went into the school office, blood all over my shirt. They called my mum and they said, he needs to go to hospital, he needs stitches. She eventually turns up at the school. I'm sitting there really distressed, and she says, "How am I going to get this blood out of your shirt? What a pain and wasting my time. We've now got to go to the hospital." And she was so cross that she had to take me to A&E and that she had a bloody shirt to deal with. And I remember consciously thinking, "Right, that's it. I'm never going to cry with her again. It's just she's not ever going to give me what I need." And that was the first of a number of incidents. I had a similar one where I broke my arm, and my mum again said I was making a fuss about nothing and wasting time. Because the first time I broke my arm, it was a crack in my elbow. And the surgeon said, "Actually, we can't put it in a cast because it's your elbow. We have to put it in a sling for a few weeks." And she said, "Well, it's not even properly broken. You didn't get a cast." So that was
Right.
so
So very
that was
dismissive of your
yeah,
needs, emotional needs,
absolutely. Yeah, literally making a fuss about nothing, whatever it was. And
because
they did
she had so much else that felt bigger to her, I
I
assume.
think so, yeah, I think, and they were similar. I mean, my dad was warmer, but I think he still had the same attitude. It was still very much like, well, he's the one with the problems. Your brother is,
Yeah.
needs a lot of help.
Yeah, it's almost like
Um,
as you were talking about these things, I was thinking these are quite normal things. I mean, they're fairly extreme normal things, but they're quite normal things that kids do go through. I had friend, I had I was in A&E once or twice as a kid. Most kids are. My kids have been. Um, so for them, I suppose it must have felt like, well, this is normal. This is childhood stuff compared to what was going on with your brother, which was not normal at all. But for you, as a child with this going on, it was huge because the pain, the drama of it all.
mm, yeah, and the complete lack of empathy, I think. Um, I mean, the other thing that made it difficult is they had stacks and stacks of denial. So as well as saying he's quite needy, they also said, "Oh, he's not that bad. He's not as bad as some." Um, and they would compare me to the him that he would have been if he hadn't been disabled. So they had this fantasy of him being incredibly bright. He happens to be quite reasonable at arithmetic. He does basic sums. And they said, "Oh, he's got a talent for maths. If he'd have been normal, he probably would have been a maths genius and would have gone off to university to do maths." I remember them saying this. So then I was being compared to this fantasy brother that was incredibly capable. You know,
Right. Oh, there's something in that about compensating for what your child has and wishing it were different, but reassuring yourself about how it could have been different, would have been different. I think, is that it? Or, I mean, it's either that or it's beating yourself up about how different it could have been. It sounds like
Yeah,
they were trying to put a positive spin on everything to, as you say, deny that it was as bad as it was, to feel
yeah,
better about.
yeah. They never spoke to me about how hard it was for them, what it was like for them, which in turn kind of denied me the right to talk about that. So I don't remember them ever talking to me about what my experience was like and how it was hard for me having a brother like this. Um, and the first time I had that was actually an aunt was talking to me, and she said, "Oh, this must be really hard for you." And that was so significant; it really stays in my mind. That was the first adult that actually acknowledged what the impact on me would be. But as I say, that was kind of tied up with, they're not really allowing themselves to talk about the impact, about how hard this was. Um,
That's an interesting moment to just bring in the dilemma that I think parents have when there's something difficult in their lives. I remember, well, I do, I didn't know this at the time. I know it now looking back, but my parents went through a stage when we were quite poor. And I only know that because they never spoke to me about it. I only know that because I look at what our diet was like for a few years when I was a child. And when it noticeably and very suddenly significantly improved. Um, they never ever mentioned it to me, and I've always thought that was a good thing, and I've been quite impressed by them for that because no, I've, as a parent, I've often wondered how much to tell my own kids about how difficult I'm finding life, things in the family, and I think parents wrestle with themselves all the time about how much to let or how much to hide from their kids. What is your take on, I mean, I know what your take is, but I want to tell the listeners your take on that.
I think one of our jobs as parents is to actually teach our children how to deal with adversity. Um, and that's a really important task, that if we shield our kids from the painful realities of life, they don't get to learn. They don't get to learn from our experience and our struggles. Um, a case in point was, I remember we had a cat die when my daughter was very young. She must have been about 4 years old, 4 or 5 years old. And we were told that the cat was on the side of the road, having been hit by a car. So me and my partner went to pick up the cat and brought it home, and my daughter was with us. And we buried the cat, and my wife was distraught. She was absolutely sobbing. And we talked about it afterwards and thought, actually, that's quite a good thing that my daughter saw this. I mean, she was obviously upset too, but we were able to talk about it and say, this is a really sad thing. And it's really okay to cry about this really sad thing. So my daughter had this kind of lesson of, yeah, painful things happen, and we survive them, and it's okay to have feelings about it. So I think I understand the desire to protect, but I think what that can do is it makes things secretive,
Mhm.
um, and kids think, oh, it's not okay to talk about this. It's not okay to have feelings about this because my parents don't. They're the role models. So if they don't talk about this, either it's not a problem or it's so awful that it can't be talked about. And I think that's an unconscious message that gets transmitted. Is like, this must be terrible if they're not going to talk about it, and we have to keep it a secret and not tell anybody. And I think that's the beginnings. That's part of shame, is having an experience that is taboo. There's something terribly, terribly wrong about this. And so I got the message, I think, growing up, the fact that they never talked about how difficult it was having my brother meant that that clearly was not something we should ever contemplate. And I think that's what was going on for them. They couldn't go there. It was just too awful to talk about.
Yeah, so you talked about shame, um, and yeah, I want to kind of pick your brains on what that feels like, and get you to just explain, if you will, for the listeners, anyone who's in this situation as a parent or as an individual who's experienced it within their family, because we're not just talking about children with deafness, we're talking about children with anything that is noticeably different about them, anything that is more challenging than, I'm doing air quotes for those who are just listening, the norm. Um, what does shame feel like? How does it manifest? How do people know that shame is what they are experiencing in this situation? Maybe as parents or as siblings.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people muddle up is guilt and shame. So guilt is I've done something wrong. I feel bad about something I've done, but I can do something about that. I can apologize, not do it again. I can restore in a way. Shame runs a lot deeper, which is I am wrong. There's something faulty about me. Um, and I think what's really important for us as human beings is to belong. Belonging is essential to our survival. We don't exist in a vacuum. We need each other. So we've got this very deep drive to belong to a group, belong to a family, have people in our lives, have connections. And I think anything that threatens that possibility of belonging becomes problematic. So in my case, being in a disabled family meant I felt different to my peers. I felt different to all the people I was in school with. I didn't know anybody else that had a disabled sibling. So I felt different. And that difference translates, I think, in a child to there's something wrong with me. I don't belong here. And people are going to discover there's something wrong with me. So I think the incident with seeing my brother with the hearing aid is like, oh, I've been found. I've been discovered as being different and
Hmm.
wrong. So I think that's the origins of shame. And then what happens with that is that we then want to hide that part of ourselves. So when I was talking about going into town with my brother, what I wanted most in the world was hide my family's disability. I wanted
Hmm.
to hide my brother. I didn't want people to know that I was disabled in the sense. So that's one level of it is hiding difference and not talking about it. Um, and that's kind of stayed with me quite a lot. It's something I don't talk about an awful lot. Um, and I remember somebody a few years ago saying to me, "You never use his name." So it's always just like my brother when I do talk about him,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting. So that there was a kind of disconnect in me. And I
Yeah.
realized that I lived two lives. I was split. Um, and it was interesting listening to people that come from two cultures uh, who have a similar experience. That, if you're English Asian, for instance, there was one of the speakers at TED this year in St. Albans who was talking about the split between her Asian family and her very white identity in the outside world.
Yeah.
And that really resonated with me because I think I did the same. I had my outside life and my friends and school and very much a kind of a whole personality that was John in the outside world.
Yeah.
And then there was John in home. And the other thing the other speaker spoke about, which resonated, was how mortified I would have been for the two worlds to meet.
Yeah.
I didn't want the outside world to come into my home. I didn't want friends to come round to my house. And I didn't want my house to go and interact with the outside world. So I think that's a strong factor with shame, that when we feel shame, we actually want to hide. We want to split off and deny that part of ourselves. If possible, make it not exist. So,
I think that's
yeah.
going to resonate with quite a lot of people, because I actually think that a lot of teenagers do a little bit of that anyway, as we all grow up want to separate from our very embarrassing
Your
parents.
parents are so embarrassing. Yes.
Yeah, I think families with children who have got something different and challenging, that's going to land really significantly for them, I think. Um, what do you think? Hmm, I've got three questions in my head. I'm going to go with this one. Have you spoken to your parents since, as an adult now, about what happened and how you felt?
Very little. I mean, they both died quite a few years ago now, so, I mean, the opportunity's gone. And I left home while I was still at school, which means that, there was a kind of limit to my relationship with my parents, actually. I think it goes very deep and very far-reaching, that I didn't have very open communication with them. Um, yeah, I mean, certainly not talking about my brother. Um, I did have quite a row, actually, with my dad once, which was similar to what you're asking. Um, they were experimenting with my brother going into respite care. This was, they moved to North Wales, which is why I left home, because they moved to North Wales while I was still at school, and I stayed in this neck of the woods. Um, so in North Wales, I went to visit them, and they were trying out respite care for my brother. So he would go into a care home for a week and come out again. And it happened to coincide with when I was up there that we were going to pick him up. So we went to this care home to pick him up. And in the care home, in the living room, there was a woman who was almost horizontal in a wheelchair, one of these kind of reclining ones, who was pretty much totally disabled. And the whole time we were there, she was screaming, just screamed and screamed and screamed, just made all this noise the whole time. And as we came away, and I was sitting in the car with my parents, I said, it makes you question whether or not her quality of life is worth it. Whether, you know, she would have been better off not being alive, really. And my dad completely lost his temper. And he says, "You can't question that. You can't say that. It's not for us to decide." And I thought, oh, I really hit a nerve there. And clearly, that was something he couldn't even contemplate, that, that, say, euthanasia would be an option, or even termination, the idea of terminating a baby if you believed that they were going to be severely disabled. Um, so that's probably the only experience that I can remember that I kind of raised the subject about what an awful life. And in a sense, I was kind of suggesting, wouldn't everybody be better off if this disabled person wasn't here? Which sounds really cruel, but actually, the quality of life for everybody concerned was absolutely awful. Severely disabled person that just screams all day. So I think that was a bit of a warning shot that, okay, I can't really talk to them about this.
Well, yet again, that's what was running through my mind as you were talking about it. Yet again, you can't talk about your opinion on any of it. And I'm imagining. I mean, you said that they were a very Christian, so of course that touches a nerve for them. But I'm also imagining that there was an implication there in his mind that if she shouldn't exist, should your brother exist, which is quite
Yes.
hard to take.
Yes. Yes. I think it was something that they couldn't contemplate, really. They just wouldn't go there. Because I think what it also does is it means acknowledging how awful this all is,
Yes.
which is the thing that they never did,
No,
you know.
they were just
And as I
avoiding
say,
knowing how awful it was.
absolutely, yeah, which I think then became a gag to me. It was like,
Yeah.
okay, that's it's off. We
Off the
can't do that.
table again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, the reason I asked that question is because I wonder what your advice would be to parents who are wrestling with this kind of situation in their homes.
I would say, I mean, it sounds pretty obvious, but it takes work, and that is, don't forget the other child. if there's another child in this dynamic. I've recently, just 2 weeks ago, I joined a siblings group for siblings with who have got a sibling with a disability of some kind. Um, and I think there was quite a lot of commonality within the group about the disabled sibling always coming first. And all of us were sort of touching upon self-neglect, really, that we've all been raised to put our sibling first and ignore our own needs.
Right.
And so I think we have to be quite proactive as parents when one child is demanding a lot of our attention, a lot of input. And I do acknowledge how hard this is, that can be all encompassing, all consuming. But if there's another child,
Mm.
what about them? They're still a child. They still
Mhm.
have the needs of a child where they need care and support, and they've got their emotional crises, as well as any physical problems they might have. That working really hard to see them as separate and distinct and having their own needs, um, and being treated as special. One of the things that drew me to the siblings group was years ago, I came across them in America, and they were set up to support children who had siblings with disability. And they would do summer camps for these kids and take them out and treat them, treat them to some respite themselves, like, let's all go and do something fun and that you're important too. And
Right.
it seemed that actually quickly evolved into really realizing that those kids needed emotional support. So they would start doing groups with these kids and actually really making the effort to talk to them about what life was like for them, which I was really inspired by. And I thought, oh, that's fabulous. I think this needs to happen.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's a long answer, but it's like, can you treat the other child as special from time to time? It's a bit like, I've had this experience myself as a parent, is having a second child and realizing the first child can be losing something in that process. And
Absolutely.
they still need to they still need to feel like they're special.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with my kids, I quite enjoy me and my wife going out with my older daughter sometimes on our own when my son's away or he's at school or something, so that she still gets a bit of that time, that being special, that she's important. Um, and as I say, I really get how hard that can be if you've got a child with extra needs.
Yeah. Well, this is the difficulty all around, isn't it? Everybody's suffering. Everyone, the whole family has a problem when one child has a problem. And this is when the guilt kicks in, and this happens in stereotypical families. The guilt kicks in when the second child is born, and then I just look. We could go into shame, but that's a whole other episode. I'm fascinated by how that guilt turns into the shame and the people pleasing. Maybe it comes from being a people pleaser originally for the reasons that you've mentioned. But yeah, parenting's really, really tough.
Yes, and we have limited resources, and I think that's a factor. We do our best. And to some extent, as long as you're alive, it's never too late. You know, having those conversations and saying, actually, yeah, I feel you've been a bit neglected. I'm sorry about that. Like, let's do something about it. Even with an adult child.
I've heard you say that before. I think you've said that to me before when I've been banging on about, "My God, I've been such a bad parent." And I love that there's still time to repair. It doesn't stop when they go off to
Yeah,
university and find their own friends and move out and get their own life. You can still have those conversations.
absolutely. And I think they can be really healing for both sides. And I really firmly believe our kids don't need us to be perfect. In fact, they learn from us being imperfect. Um, and what they need is the opportunity to kind of talk about stuff and process it.
Yeah.
We can make mistakes. I remember my first boss used to say the worst thing you can do to a child is frighten them, because if you frighten the child, you silence them.
Mhm.
Whereas what we want, as hard as it is if we make a mistake, if we annoy our child, if they have the freedom to react, then you're
Mm.
then you're processing it. Like, I really don't like what you said there, Dad. I don't like the way you treated me. Okay, let's talk about it. There's a kind of it's organic, it moves. So, yeah, there's something about just being open for the conversation and not shutting it down. Um, Whatever that conversation is, whether they feel left out or that things are unfair. I mean, I think that's the theme in all families, but it can be especially strong in a family with a disability. That
Yeah.
there's an imbalance, there's an unfairness. Um, and I certainly felt that all my life. My brother got away with things that I could never get away with.
Right.
And I would be kicking him under the dining room table. I was just like incensed what he could get away with that I would get told off for.
Yeah.
So there's a sense of injustice and unfairness that was always shut down. It's like, well, you need to be more understanding. He can't help it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh
Mm.
god, yeah. I'm kinda there with you. Um,
Mm.
we could keep going, but I wanna talk about the thank you for sharing all of that because I know that's super personal, but I think so much of what you said there will land with a lot of people, I think. Um, what drove you to consider getting up on a stage and talking to people about and I want to introduce the topic of I will put the link in the show notes for anyone that's intrigued. John spoke about why we all have the capacity to hate other people and why we shouldn't be in denial about that. I mean, what possessed you to get up on stage and talk about that?
Well, I think it worked at two levels. One was I just thought I've always liked TED Talks. I thought I really like the format. It's like, you've got 12 or 20 minutes to put an idea across and that's it, rather than droning on for a whole day as a keynote speaker. So I like the format, first of all. I thought it was dynamic and just this idea of like an idea that you put out there. But beyond that, I just thought, what a fabulous experience to do that and to learn a new skill. I mean, it's not obvious, but I talk to groups for a living. I'm a trainer, but that's a very different style. That's very free floating. I'm having a conversation with a group of students. Um, the idea of presenting really to a sea of faces with no feedback is a very different skill. We're talking about keynote speaking. And I thought, what a fabulous opportunity to develop that skill. And it was. I mean, the team were brilliant. We got coaching, we got lots of feedback. Our scripts were analyzed. We had a voice coach working with us. Um, and I just felt like I learned so much from the process and being part of that whole community. There's an amazing amount of people involved in putting this together. There must have been about 20 people in the team. There was a social media team, there was a videographer team, there was a photographer, and they're all really, really skillful professionals. So you've got this amazing bunch of people, as well as my speakers, who were a fabulous, really interesting bunch of people. We were
Yes,
really
they're always
supportive of each
fascinating.
other. It felt like just a very special experience. So I think I got a sense of that when I applied. I want to be part of this. Um, and it has been it's been absolutely wonderful. It's been a lovely experience, a lovely thing to be a part of. And I'm kind of really proud of what we all did. I mean, I really, I don't, it's not down to one person. It's a little bit like the Oscars where the main actor gets all the glory. And it's like, actually, it probably takes 300 people to make a movie. Yeah,
Mm.
the actor is a very small part of it, and I feel a bit like that with TED. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I did a talk, but actually without all those people, none of this would have happened, and I certainly wouldn't get the views I got if the quality of the output wasn't top
Yeah,
notch.
it is a very good, organisation. This is TEDx St Albans we're talking about. They were in their 2nd year, is it was it 2nd year?
Yes, yeah, this is
And
the
they're
second time.
growing. It's gonna be even bigger next year. But I think everywhere TEDx is a really professional organisation, and what an amazing opportunity. How did you deal with the nerves of being up there?
Um, Probably against what everything else I say when I'm a trainer. I actually just kind of blocked it. Um, I was very nervous in the lead up because I just couldn't remember my speech. I went over it and over and over it. And I had real difficulty remembering it all. And I think part of the problem was the way I'd written it was actually quite disconnected. It was a lot of different
Mm,
concepts, different ideas,
okay.
whereas most people told a story, and that feels a lot more organic and simpler. Um, so I had real problems remembering it all. So I was the nerves were there before a
Yeah.
lot, and then on the day I just thought I've just got to do it. I was backstage about to go on, and I just like just do it, just go out there and do it. You know? Um,
Yeah.
and you actually try not to focus too much on my nerves, just focus on delivery, you know, and yeah, don't overwhelm myself. There's a few tips I picked up as well about what you're telling yourself about how it's going to go. So, literally, if you're sort of imagining that it goes badly, you're going to be very nervous. And somebody said, even imagine it going well is a distraction. You've just got to be in the moment.
Right.
So what
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
tried to do as I walked out on stage is just focus on delivering, nothing else.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like the exam nerves thing.
Yeah, yeah, it was prior, and then yes, like if you go into an exam knowing your subject, it's actually quite a buzz. You can focus and just do it. Yeah, it's a bit like
Yeah.
that. Looking at the video now, I can see that my voice was kind of shaky throughout. But I'm actually okay about that because I think that's emotionally appropriate. What I was talking about was emotional,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and it,
Yeah.
it probably added the fact that I was a little bit hesitant or a little bit shaky.
Yeah. Yeah. You looked, I was in the audience. You looked just thoughtful. Like you were really thinking about what you had to say. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It did add to it. Anyone who is interested, and I can't imagine you wouldn't be. The talk is called "Why Do We Hate?" Is that right?
Yes, I mean what I was fascinated by really, it came out of an article I wrote a long time ago, where I thought we are constantly looking at being loving, being kind, how we're trying to be, offer each other unconditional positive regard and these sorts of ideas. And I thought, well, we're missing something here, which is so often we don't do those things. So often we can be cruel and unkind, and I think it's quite dangerous actually to see the bad people as being something different. um, we've got this underlying concept of our society that some people are just bad or some people are evil, which is very simplistic. And it just means, oh, it's somewhere over there. It's not me. And the reality is, if you look at world history, it is ordinary people that do horrible things. As I said in the talk, that most Nazis were very ordinary people. They weren't exceptional. A lot of them were kind of clerks and sort of middle class, you know, fairly normal people. And so what I was quite fascinated, and I am really quite fascinated by what switches that switch. What gets us to, switch into being horrible, horrible. And we can all do it, and we can all do it on lots of different levels. So we could be horrible to ourselves, we can be horrible to our kids, let alone on the global scale. So that was the motivation. That was what I was interested in. And the more I kind of looked at it, the more I thought, there's so many different aspects to this. There's so many different ways in which we can be horrible. You know?
Yeah. Go and it's and we're not and none of us is immune to it. That's the point that I think you were making that I really like. So everybody that's listening right now, if you're fascinated by this idea that you don't like to think of yourself as someone that could hate another person, go and have a watch of John's talk. The link is in the show notes, or you can find it on St Albans TEDx. We find it on the TEDx site. The link's in the show notes. Just press the link. Um, John, we've got to draw it to a close. I wish we could carry on for a lot longer, but I feel like I could sit and chat to you for well, we have, haven't we? Chatted for nearly a week at a time, and it's still never enough. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you've had to say today. Let people know where they can find you.
The Albany Centre in St Albans. Our main website is thealbanycentre.com.
Amazing. So I will put links to both of those, and the Albany Centre is also on Facebook, and Jon is on LinkedIn. I'll put those links in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jon.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Cheers.
Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give it a rating on your podcast app. And if you know someone who might benefit from listening, do share it with them. It also means a lot when you give me feedback. So if you have comments or suggestions for another episode, or know someone who'd like to tell their story on the Teenage Kicks podcast, do get in touch at helen@helenwills.com, or come and find me on my blog, actuallymommy.co.uk. Head over there now for more articles on the joys, and there are many, of parenting a teenager. Bye for now.